Hey mamas, and welcome back to another episode of Knit Your Stress Away, the podcast for busy mamas who want to find an outlet that is creative, but also gives them peace, calm, and quiet time. And knitting is that for me. So I'm here to pass this on to all of you out there as well. I am Nadine Medina. I'm your host here on the podcast. And today I have a super quick episode for you and for all of you beginners who are in need of little tips and tricks that they may not be able to find easily anywhere. And today we're talking about joining yarn when you have to switch from one yarn ball to another. So let's dive into this episode. Welcome to Knit Your Stress Away. I am Nadine Medina, a mom who rediscovered knitting during a stressful season and found it to be the ultimate way to relax, recharge, and reconnect with myself. If you're feeling overwhelmed and wondering if there's a creative outlet that could actually help you feel calmer and in more control, you're in the right place. In this podcast, I'll show you how knitting can be a simple, stress-busting tool, even if you've never picked up needles before. So take a deep breath, let go of the chaos for a moment, and let's explore how knitting could become your new favorite way to find calm and joy. Really quickly, before we get started with this episode, talking about joining yarn mid-project, I wanted to let you know that we are only 2 short weeks away from the next Knit Your Stress Away workshop. I'm super excited to bring these workshops to you. They're going to happen seasonally, so about every quarter. And the first one is actually happening on January 29th. Currently, I don't even have the sign-up page ready yet for you, but what I do have is a page where you can put your email and your name in if you want to know first about, when it's ready to sign up. So you can go over to theknittingmamas.com/workshop and you can pop your email in there. And then as soon as I have the registration page ready, which should be in about a week from when this episode airs, so about the 21st of January of 2025, so that you can be one of the first people to sign up for the workshop, because there is a limited amount of registrants that I can accept for this. In this workshop, you are going to learn the very basics of knitting. You're going to know how to cast on, and you're going to learn how to knit the knit stitch. And we are going to start a very small project that you then can continue and finish at home on your own time. So excited about bringing this to you again this season. So be sure to register or put your name in there if you want to be on the wait list and be one of the first people to know when the registration page goes live. All right, let's dive into this episode. I am going to share my go-to yarn joining technique, which is very simple, but maybe a little unconventional, but it works for me. So I am all about, making this not stressful. And I do remember there was a time when I was like, oh my gosh, I am like literally stressed out about joining this new yarn ball into this project because I just don't know how to do it. And I just don't want you to be that person. Like, I want you to be like, I know exactly how to do this, and it's super simple. And maybe if you've already been knitting for a little while, you've been doing it my way too. Again, there's no knitting police to tell you, hey, that's not right. But there are easy ways and then there are not so easy ways, right? So it's sort of like, different knitting techniques to like literally how you do the stitches. There's continental knitting, which is what I teach and what I do. And then there is the throwing method where you hold the yarn in the other hand. So it all depends on what you're used to and what you've learned. But some of them, in my opinion, are easier than others. And sometimes I see knitting stitches and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't even know how to hold my hands to do that. So long story short, I used to be very intimidated when it comes to joining yarn. So when you need more than one skein for your project, there's going to be the point where you have to join in new yarn. And you don't want it to unravel. You don't want it to be loose and all weird. But I am a firm believer of there not being a right or wrong way, but just what works for you. So maybe there's people who are going to come after me after this episode because I'm doing it this way. But I say give it a try and see if it works for you too. So it's actually how my grandma taught me. So I'm not even going to say that this is wrong or right, because this is the only way I know. I've seen some really cool looking ways of joining yarn out there. And so it sort of depends what you're making. But let's say if you're making something extremely like beginner, right? Something very simple that doesn't really require, for example, color changes or knitting in the round, or you've seen like some very like extensive and complicated color work maybe out there. There may be differences in how to join the yarn so that there's no way for you to actually notice it or see it. But when you're knitting a scarf, when you're knitting something that where the ends or the sides are going to be joined and seamed later on, this technique works very well. But once again, I am also always looking at other videos, and I, love scrolling Instagram for knitting tips and hacks. And I have seen some pretty cool ways to do that. But to be honest, not all of them look like they're easy to me. So whenever I can, I stick with this. So let's talk about how I do this. So I usually try to join the yarn at the beginning of a new row. So what that means is that you're going to just finish the last row, flip it over, and then start over start the next row. This involves that you can sort of gauge how, when you're at the end of your yarn ball and you just have a little bit left over, you kind of have to gauge, okay, is this enough to knit another whole row, or am I going to be stuck in the middle? Stuck in the middle is also not a huge deal. You can still use this, but I prefer it to be on the edge because it's easier to then hide it later and no one will see it. And also, just to be safe, just to be safe, not sorry, however that saying goes in English, just leave a long enough strand of the yarn that you're almost done with. And don't start knitting the next row. If you're like, oh, I don't know if it's going to be long enough, just don't do it, right? Just switch to the new yarn and cut off the rest later on. Not a big deal. So at the start of a new row, you just kind of let go of the tail of the old yarn and let it just sort of hang there. And then you take the end of your new yarn and just kind of, give yourself a little bit of space. So you want to let maybe 10 inches or maybe 5 to 10 inches or so kind of hang off to the side as well. And then you just start wrapping the yarn around your finger like you would do with the old one. Then you're going to just start knitting the row, knit about maybe 5 to 10 stitches. And you will notice that the beginning, like the first 3 or so stitches, are going to be a little bit loose and kind of wonky on the needle, but that's okay. So as soon as you're down like 10, maybe even 15 stitches, you can safely push your work back on the needle a little bit so that it doesn't come off, lay it down, and then you're going to go back to the beginning and you just kind of gently pull tight on your stitches so that they all look really nice and neat again at the beginning. And you're going to pull on both ends. So the end of the new one and then the end of the old yarn. So kind of tighten them up a little bit. And then in order for them to stay that tight, you are simply going to tie a knot between them. Okay. So I usually do a double knot and make sure that it's nice and tight, but not too tight, because you're going to notice on the way back, once you're back at that place where you did the knot, you're going to notice that first stitch might be a little bit tight if that knot became too tight. So just kind of feel that out a little bit. But as soon as that's done, you can just let it go, let it hang there, and then keep going. And you're just going to do your thing. You're just going to keep knitting. So now you're like, what happens at the end when I have that little tail hanging there? Well, that is what is called weave in your ends. This is what you, for some people, sadly, for me, not so sadly, have to do after you're completed a project. Why sadly? Well, there's a lot of people out there who are like, oh my gosh, I hate weaving in ends because it's not knitting, right? It's like taking an actual sewing needle, threading the yarn through there, and then start to kind of sort of sew. That's what it feels like. And I feel like a lot of knitters are like, yeah, but I don't sew, but I have to, right? You have to seam stuff sometimes, and then you have to, fill a little hole maybe sometimes. And you definitely have to weave in ends if you do not want to have little strands just kind of hanging randomly off of your finished project. I personally find it meditative because it's a very, nice slow motion, and you can just do your little thing and weave the little end through the loops. I don't find it anything bad, to be honest with you. I enjoy it. So with that said, I don't know where you fall here, but that end needs to be woven in either way. But that's all you're going to do. You're just going to take those two ends that you have after you tied that knot, like way back, way in the end, whenever you're completely done with your project. And then you're going to start weaving them in. I usually prefer to leave a longer tail to weave in. It's just easier for me to give it a lot of room and then to have a too short one. And then the end is kind of sort of woven in and not far enough. And then it might come undone. One other thing that I wanted to mention is that when you happen to have a project where the side of your project is going to be put together and sewn to another side of your project. For example, if you're making a sweater, even as a beginner, this is absolutely totally possible for you. If you're like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start, you can totally make a sweater like next month. Like, come to the workshop. I'm going to show you how to do the basics. And after that, your next project can be a sweater. I promise. It's like so cool. But for example, if you make a sweater as a beginner, usually it's a sweater that doesn't involve any decreasing, increasing. It's just a simple rectangle panel in the front, rectangle panel in the back, and then you'll have some sleeves that are usually also rectangles that you sew together. So if you're switching midway in your project, you're switching yarn balls, you have that thing hanging off of most likely the side, maybe the top. It depends, right? How the rectangle kind of falls. But usually it's on the side. And then when you seam it together with the next rectangle to form your sweater, you literally have a wrong and a right side. So the inside of your sweater or the outside. And you can then weave those ends into the inside, the wrong side. And when you seam it together, you can't even see it. The knot will disappear because you're just sewing the sides together. You can't even see it in the end. And you're going to have like all the peace of mind. Nothing's going to come undone. And it's the simplest way, in my opinion, to do this. So if you're like, what the heck did you just talk about? This is one of those episodes. We have a few of them where I'm kind of explaining something visual, but it may be like totally going over your head if you don't have your project right there in front of you and in your hand. I highly suggest saving this episode. Listen to it again later when you do have your project right there with you, and you can literally follow along with what I'm telling you and what I'm teaching you. So this is definitely save for a later episode. You can also go ahead and just share it in your Instagram stories, because that way you also have it saved. But definitely if you're feeling like, I need to see this, right? I don't know how to do this. I have no idea what you just described. Totally okay. No big deal. Come on over into our community. And I am usually going over the tips that we talk about on the podcast in a more visual format inside the group. I just do a live video in there. And you can go ahead, come in there, see what else we have going on in there. And then you're going to catch the live video or the recording later of how to join the yarn in a more visual format, like in video. Makes it a lot easier. You can find the group, if you're not in there yet, it's at the Knitting Mama, www.theknittingmamas.com/group. You can hop into the group. I'm going to have to approve that you want to become a member. And then we can hang out in there and you can see all the goodness that we have for you in there. And if you are a total beginner and you don't even have your tools yet and your materials to start knitting, I got you covered there too. You can download the cheat sheet that I have made for you. It's totally free. It's the 3 things you need to start knitting, and you can find it at theknittingmamas.com/start. All right. So that was a lot of links. I'm putting them all in the show notes for you so that you can get all your resources and all the things ready, and hopefully also sign up to be on the wait list for the workshop, which happens on January 29th. Super duper excited about that. I cannot wait to see all of your faces in there so I can teach you how to knit for stress relief. All right. I'll catch you next time on the Knit Your Stress Away podcast. Have a wonderful week. Thanks so much for hanging out with me on today's episode. I hope you're walking away with a bit more inspiration and a few ideas to make your self-care a priority. If today's chat gave you a little boost, I'd love it if you could leave a 5-star review on iTunes. This helps other moms discover the podcast and start finding more calm and creativity in their day as well. And don't forget to join us over in the Knitting Mamas community on Facebook by going to theknittingmamas.com/group. Thanks again, and remember, you deserve time for yourself to recharge and feel your best. Catch you next time on the Knit the Stress Away podcast.